The silence inside the private quarters of Buckingham Palace carried a far heavier weight than any public outburst of anger ever could. King Charles did not raise his voice to the aides standing by the door, nor did he summon the remaining members of the royal family for one last chaotic round of discussions. Instead, with a steady but visibly heavy hand, the reigning monarch slowly lowered his fountain pen onto a final, official palace order. It was a single administrative act, a quiet stroke of ink on parchment, but it carried a devastating decision that would strike directly at two of his youngest and most distant grandchildren. Prince Archie and Princess Lilibet were officially and permanently removed from the royal holiday list. This decisive signature effectively put an end to any remaining expectation that the Sussex children would ever again join the family's private seasonal gatherings under protective shadow of the British crown. To the outside world, the royal holiday list might seem like a simple calendar of social engagements, but within the strict walls of the institution, it was a definitive master schedule that decided who belonged and who was excluded. It governed who would walk the cold paths of Sandringham for Christmas, who would spend the quiet summer weeks at Balmoral, who would appear at the traditional Easter church services, and who would be captured in the historic family photographs that defined the monarchy for generations. By removing those two young names, King Charles was not just altering a guest list. He was systematically erasing two places from the active fabric of royal family life. For years, through all the bitter media wars, the public allegations, and the deep emotional estrangement between Prince Harry and the firm, the names of Archie and Lilibet had remained on that list. Their presence on that document had served as a fragile, unspoken bridge connecting Harry's isolated life in California to the historic world he had abruptly left behind. Now, that final bridge had been completely cut by a single sovereign signature. As Charles placed the pen down beside the completed order, he remained entirely silent, refusing to utter a word to the advisors waiting in the room. Queen Camilla watched his face closely, noting the sudden tightening of his jaw and the profound sorrow hidden behind his eyes. She understood the deep, agonizing conflict that the king refused to show to the public. In signing this document, Charles had acted strictly as a sovereign, the absolute head of the institution, who must protect the crown at all costs. Yet, the grandfather inside him could not escape the immense personal cost of that choice. The formal communication of this decision did not go through public relations channels. It was delivered directly to Prince Harry through a highly private, secure palace channel. When the message arrived in California, Harry read the cold, precise words once, and then read them again, staring at the screen as if waiting for the text to miraculously alter its meaning. Meghan watched her husband from across the room, watching the color drain from his face before a wave of intense fury took over. She heard the raw anger and disbelief in his voice when he finally looked up and said that this was no longer just a dispute about Christmas arrangements. To Harry, this was an official declaration of war, a formal statement from the palace that his innocent children were now being treated as complete outsiders, stripped of their birthright. The palace order carried one specific phrase that made the emotional blow feel even colder to the Duke of Sussex: final and non-negotiable. King Charles was not opening the floor for further family debates or transatlantic negotiations. He was permanently closing the door before another public argument could even begin. Prince William had already been fully informed of the move. The Prince of Wales knew exactly what his father intended to do long before the pen ever touched the paper, and his complete silence during the process raised an even darker fear in Harry's mind. This was not merely a tactical decision made by the current aging monarch. It was a definitive hint of how the future king intended to define the boundaries of the royal family when the crown eventually passed to him. Harry's immediate reaction was not one of sorrow or grief, but pure, unadulterated fury. Within mere hours of receiving the official notification, he demanded an immediate, direct telephone conversation with his father, bypassing the wall of palace courtiers. He sent a warning back to the channels stating that the palace had crossed an unforgivable line by weaponizing innocent children who had no part in this adult conflict. But before any confrontation could take place, a painful and complicated truth had to be faced by everyone involved. Every single adult caught in this multi-generational battle genuinely believed that they were acting out of love and protecting Archie and Lilibet from the toxic actions of the other side. At the very center of this massive institutional earthquake were two young children who were far too young to comprehend why their names had become weaponized symbols in a bitter war between generations. Prince Archie only knew the United Kingdom through distant bedtime stories, old family photographs, and fragmented pieces of history shared by his parents. Princess Lilibet carried the historic childhood nickname of a legendary great-grandmother she had barely had the brief opportunity to look at. Yet, completely surrounding their innocent lives stood for powerful adults, Charles, Harry, Meghan, and William, each absolute in their conviction that true protection required a completely different, incompatible path. King Charles viewed the traditional royal holidays as something far greater than private vacations or seasonal breaks from work. To the monarch, these gatherings were sacred, rare moments when the sprawling royal family could quietly renew its internal bonds, completely away from the relentless scrutiny of the public eye. Attendance at Sandringham or Balmoral demanded absolute trust, total silence regarding internal matters, and an unwavering willingness to place the stability of the family above personal publicity or commercial gain. Without those strict, unspoken conditions, even the celebration of Christmas would quickly degenerate into another volatile battlefield for the press. Prince Harry, however, viewed those private gatherings through a completely different lens. The Duke firmly believed that these seasonal events offered the absolute last chance for Archie and Lilibet to truly know their Windsor relatives, to play with their royal cousins, and to form real bonds with their grandparents without the interference of cameras, formal announcements, or carefully managed palace PR campaigns. Losing that access meant losing far more than a seat at a holiday dinner table. It meant his children were being robbed of ordinary, human memories with their own bloodline, denying them a rich family history that belonged to them by right of birth. Meghan sat quietly beside her husband as he struggled to process the gravity of the palace order, feeling a deep wave of anger rise within her. But beneath that fury was a painful, familiar sense of validation. The Duchess had long harbored a fear that official royal titles would never be enough to guarantee genuine, heartfelt acceptance for her children within the royal fold. Now, the palace had provided undeniable, written proof that royal status could easily remain on a piece of paper, while any true sense of personal belonging could be completely erased in daily practice. Harry's internal pain, however, came from a place much deeper and older. He vividly remembered entering the grand halls of Sandringham for Christmas as a young boy, right after the tragic loss of his mother, Princess Diana. In those dark days, the rigid royal rituals and traditions had briefly made a shattered, grieving family feel whole and protected. Those ancient traditions had never managed to erase his deep childhood grief, but they had at least given that grief a safe, structured shelter. Now, as a father, he felt a crushing weight knowing that his own innocent children were being actively denied that same fragile comfort by their own grandfather. Far away in London, King Charles stood entirely alone in a private room, staring at a framed photograph that captured all 5 of his grandchildren together during a happier moment. The king looked deeply at the face of Archie, then shifted his gaze to Lilibet, and his expression visibly tightened with a mixture of regret and resolve. In a quiet, solitary gesture, he reached out and turned the frame slightly away toward the wall before exiting the room, without calling for any of his staff. The movement was incredibly small, almost imperceptible, but it revealed the profound emotional toll that the official order had taken on his soul. Prince William, meanwhile, carried an entirely different set of institutional fears. The Prince of Wales believed that the constant, unpredictable uncertainty surrounding the Sussex's potential holiday visits had actively begun to disrupt the daily lives of his own children, George, Charlotte, and Louis. His children never knew whether a private family reunion would remain peaceful or whether it would later be dissected and transformed into ammunition for another highly public media dispute. William wanted absolute stability for the future of the monarchy, even if achieving that stability required drawing a painful, permanent boundary against his own brother. Queen Camilla had explicitly warned the king that completely removing the children from the holiday list would inevitably look like a cruel public punishment for the controversial choices made by their parents. The queen consort feared that history would judge the specific act far more harshly than the palace advisors anticipated. Charles had responded quietly, arguing that keeping Archie and Lilibet on an official list that no one trusted had become its own form of prolonged cruelty. The final order, however, had not materialized out of thin air. It was a direct result of a catastrophic breakdown in trust that had occurred months earlier during one private, highly sensitive holiday conversation that went completely wrong. When the palace legal team looked back to find the exact moment, everything changed. Every single path led directly back to one disastrous, emotionally charged evening discussion regarding an invitation to Balmoral. The tension that ultimately shattered the remaining foundations of trust within the royal family did not accumulate overnight, nor was it merely the continuous buildup of years of bitter media warfare across the Atlantic Ocean. The structural collapse actually began with one very specific, highly confidential invitation, followed by a fragile private promise, and ended in a disastrous evening conversation at Balmoral Castle that was never intended to be shared outside those ancient stone walls. Months before the final non-negotiable order was officially drafted and signed by the monarch, King Charles had actually been prepared to make a significant emotional concession to restore Prince Archie and Princess Lilibet back to the very heart of the royal family's traditional summer gathering. Prince Harry, on his part, had been genuinely willing to consider a temporary return to his homeland, setting aside his deep personal grievances for the sake of his young children. But long before any concrete travel arrangements could be finalized, a single, sharp disagreement regarding security measures, personal privacy, and institutional control instantly transformed what was supposed to be a historic family reconciliation into an explosive, irreversible confrontation. Several months earlier, during a quiet period of reflection, King Charles had privately reached out to Harry and Meghan, offering them and their children a designated short stay at Balmoral, the historic royal residence in Scotland. This remote Scottish estate, traditionally used by the ruling monarch and close relatives as a private sanctuary away from the relentless public gaze, was carefully chosen because Charles believed it would provide the necessary distance from intense media pressure. There would be absolutely no official royal engagement scheduled, no formal press access allowed on the grounds, and no staged family reunions designed for the cameras to exploit. The king sincerely believed that this quiet, unpublicized visit could repair the deep emotional fractures that public speeches, formal letters, and legal statements could never hope to heal. He desperately wanted his young grandchildren, Archie and Lilibet, to spend uninterrupted time playing with their royal cousins, George, Charlotte, and Louis, away from the heavy operational burdens of the crown. The monarch also wished for his grandchildren to know him as a real, loving grandfather through ordinary, everyday family moments, rather than knowing him only through grand royal titles, cold official statements, and bitter arguments carried back and forth across a massive ocean. Prince Harry did not immediately reject his father's unexpected invitation, as many palace courtiers had predicted he would. He genuinely wanted to believe that the offer was a sincere, heartfelt gesture of peace from a father who was growing older and facing his own health challenges. Yet, due to his deep-seated distrust of the palace apparatus, during a late-evening phone call specifically arranged to discuss the technical logistics of the visit, the Duke of Sussex firmly requested explicit, legally binding written guarantees. These demands covered independent, high-level royal security forces, completely private accommodation away from the main house, and an absolute, unconditional right to leave the United Kingdom immediately if Meghan felt unsafe, unsupported, or unwelcome at any point during their stay. King Charles heard nothing but deep, unyielding distrust in every single condition put forward by his younger son. The monarch, feeling insulted and exhausted by the legalistic approach, calmly told Harry that a warm, private family invitation to a grandfather's home could not be negotiated like a tense diplomatic summit between hostile nations. Balmoral, the king firmly insisted, was an ancient home meant to offer natural protection, historical warmth, and absolute privacy from the outside world, not another administrative battlefield governed by rigid legal demands and mutual suspicion. Harry, however, completely refused to soften his defensive position or drop his security requirements. He sharply reminded his father through the heavily recorded phone conversation that previous palace assurances regarding their safety and public treatment had repeatedly failed them in the past. The Duke stated with absolute clarity that he would never willingly place Archie or Lilibet in any royal setting where their physical safety and human dignity depended entirely on palace courtiers who still openly resented Meghan and him for leaving royal duties. King Charles felt the very final thread of paternal trust tighten and snap. The king paused, his voice dropping to a low, painful whisper, and said that if Harry could not trust his own family, then perhaps he was simply not yet ready to come home. Harry remained entirely silent on the line for several agonizing seconds, refusing to offer an apology or a compromise, and then abruptly ended the call without saying a polite goodbye. The deep emotional damage between them worsened significantly the following morning when specific, highly confidential details of the proposed Balmoral invitation suddenly appeared in a private media briefing in London. Selected, sensitive information regarding the King's peace offer had reached British journalists before the family members had even agreed on a basic timeline. Charles was deeply convinced that the Sussex team had intentionally allowed the details to escape to make themselves look like the bigger people. Harry, conversely, became absolutely certain that the palace had deliberately exposed the private invitation to control the media narrative and paint him as difficult. Prince William later learned from palace security channels that his brother had kept a detailed personal record of the intense security discussion. The Prince of Wales knew the record had not been leaked yet, but palace advisors deeply feared that any future disagreement would instantly become public evidence in another explosive media conflict. Trust had not merely weakened between the brothers. It had officially become a dangerous operational liability for the monarchy. Charles had initially prepared to simply freeze the Balmoral invitation, rather than permanently removing the children from the official list completely. But then, Harry sent one final, highly charged message directly to the King's private office, and its aggressive, uncompromising wording forced the conflict far beyond the control of careful palace advisors and polite institutional language. The very next exchange would happen directly between a heartbroken father and a furious son who was absolutely convinced he'd been betrayed by his own blood. Harry entered the next phone call completely determined to defend his children's long-term rights, while Charles entered absolutely determined to defend the dignity of the monarchy. Neither man had any intention of surrendering their position, and neither fully understood how quickly a simple argument about a seasonal holiday list would reopen every single unhealed wound between them. There were no royal aides speaking on their behalf this time, and no carefully drafted institutional statements to soften the blow. For several brutal, emotionally devastating minutes, the King of England and his younger son confronted each other simply as an estranged father and a deeply hurt child. Harry had demanded the direct conversation the very moment he learned through informal channels that Archie and Lilibet were on the verge of being permanently erased from the family arrangements. Charles had initially refused to take the call, genuinely believing that another angry, unyielding exchange across the ocean would only deepen the emotional damage and accelerate the public collapse of the family structure. The Duke of Sussex answered through a fiercely private message that continued silence from the throne would make any future reconciliation absolutely impossible, and the aging monarch finally agreed to listen. Charles took the highly sensitive call entirely alone in a small, dimly lit private sitting room at Windsor, away from the prying eyes of the household. Harry spoke directly from his home in California, with no advisors, lawyers, or palace officials listening on either end of the line. That complete isolation mattered immensely because there would be no institutional buffer, no one to soften the harshness of the language, and no one to rescue either man from the devastating emotional truths that came next. Harry passionately demanded that his children's names be immediately restored to the official holiday schedule, openly accusing the palace apparatus of using innocent toddlers to punish Meghan and him for choosing to leave active royal life behind. Charles firmly rejected the painful charge, his voice shaking slightly but remaining resolute as he insisted that the hard decision concerned access, trust, and long-term stability, not personal revenge. Harry's voice broke completely when he asked how a grandfather could actively choose to remove his own grandchildren from the warmth of Christmas celebrations. The Duke did not speak as a defiant prince in that agonizing moment. He spoke strictly as a protective father who deeply believed his children were being made to carry the heavy consequences of an adult war they did not create. Charles paused for a long time before answering, stating that a grandfather could easily forgive privately, but a sovereign, the person ultimately responsible for protecting the institutional confidence of the royal household, could not ignore repeated threats to family privacy. Harry heard only cold duty and a devastating distance that seemed impossible to cross. Charles then accused his son of turning every single private invitation into a complex diplomatic negotiation filled with legalistic conditions. Harry fired back that the palace expected blind obedience while offering absolutely no protection from calculated media leaks, public humiliation, or internal hostility. The Duke said trust could not be demanded by the exact same institution that had repeatedly failed to protect his family. Harry finally uttered the sharp words that broke through his father's remaining control, telling him that they were his grandchildren before they were ever names on a palace guest list. Charles removed his glasses and pressed his fingers firmly against his eyes, his deep personal pain finally becoming completely impossible to hide. Then came the unexpected twist that shifted the entire dynamic of the conversation. Charles quietly admitted that the official order had not yet been formally distributed to the wider royal households when Harry was first notified. For one brief, hopeful second, the Duke genuinely believed the harsh decision might still be reversed, but all hope vanished when the monarch revealed that Prince William had fully supported the permanent removal. The Prince of Wales firmly believed it was necessary for the future stability of all royal gatherings. Harry heard only the ultimate betrayal from his own brother, realizing that the future king was actively helping erase his children from the fabric of royal life. Harry ended the intense call with a dark warning that the palace might control the guest list, but it could not control what this decision revealed about the character of those who made it. Yet the signature belonged to Charles alone, and behind it stood a much deeper struggle over who now possessed the actual authority to define the modern royal family. Charles signed the document, but William had helped shape the strategic argument that made the action completely unavoidable. The Prince of Wales was no longer viewing the Sussex tensions as a temporary family dispute that could be patched over with seasonal invitations. He was thinking strictly about the survival of the monarchy he would one day inherit. William had gradually taken significantly greater control over long-term family planning, including security arrangements, access to private royal homes, and the shape of future family gatherings. The prince believed that private family moments could no longer be separated from the wider Sussex conflict, as everything threatened to become ammunition for public disputes. William paused outside Charles's private room before their final meeting, rehearsing his words because he knew exactly what supporting the removal would look like to the public. Archie and Lilibet were completely innocent children, and any decision involving them would inevitably be seen as a cruel punishment. When William entered, Charles did not soften the central question, asking his elder son if he could truly live with the emotional cost of removing two grandchildren from ancient family traditions. William answered firmly that he could live with Harry's intense anger, but he could no longer live with the continuous uncertainty placed on his own children, George, Charlotte, and Louis. William offered the crucial distinction that changed everything. Archie and Lilibet could still receive private, informal contact from their grandfather, but they would no longer hold automatic places in official royal holiday planning. Once the order entered the system, the first visible sign appeared in the empty spaces where two names had once remained. The change looked administrative, yet everyone understood the emotional sentence beneath it. Meghan received a confirmation while preparing breakfast with the children nearby, keeping her face perfectly calm until Archie left the room, then gripping the kitchen counter and telling Harry that the palace had made their rejection official. Harry wanted to launch an immediate public attack, but Meghan stopped him, warning that an angry statement would only allow the palace to argue that the removal had been entirely necessary. In Britain, Charles faced his own quiet grief, asking an aide if the children's usual Christmas gifts should still be prepared. When informed that the order did not prevent personal presence, the monarch quietly requested that they be chosen and sent entirely without palace branding. A royal aide noticed that Charles had preserved a private, handwritten list containing the birthdays of all 5 of his grandchildren in his personal desk. Archie and Lilibet remained there, proving that while the institution had removed them, the grandfather never would. That evening, Charles entered the room where family holiday photographs were kept, paused before an image of Harry as a young boy, touched the frame once, and then turned off the light. He had won the institutional argument, but victory no longer felt like strength. The palace gates remained firmly closed for the holidays, but the letter stayed with Archie and Lilibet, final proof that the crown had removed their names from its formal plans, while a grieving grandfather had completely refused to remove them from his heart.